Welcome back. Greece's new government has seen some significant changes, even though it still has the same Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, and a familiar-looking cabinet. These are the leaders who will implement tough bailout provisions. To discuss this, from Crete is Greek journalist Yannis Koutsomitis, and from London, political economist Philippe Legrain. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Yannis, let me start with you. Greece has agreed to this tough bailout. It will now be up to Prime Minister Tsipras to implement all these reforms. Is this the solution that will take Greece out of its troubles, or is this just kicking the can down the road again?
Well, this remains to be seen, because it will take at least a year and a half before we see the first results from the reforms and the fiscal adjustment and the new investment package that the Eurozone is supposed to provide Greece. For the next year and a half, it will be a very, very tough case for Greece to implement all these reforms and to also to make a fiscal adjustment that will be very severe in a country that has been suffering for 5 years of austerity already. So we need to be patient right now. There is a wide majority of more than 80% behind the bailout agreement, and the parties that have a wide majority in the parliament support the agreement. So we need to see if the agreement and the reforms will be implemented, how they will be implemented, and how soon Greece can come back from the recession.
Well, talking about how soon, Philippe, the Prime Minister, has just won a vote of confidence in Parliament. He says he can get Greece out of this financial crisis by 2019. Is that realistic?
I think it's highly unlikely. I mean, first of all, it's hard to see Greece being able to actually implement the reforms that are demanded of it. It's one thing to pass an act in Parliament. It's quite another to implement them in the economy as a whole when you don't have a functioning modern public administration. Second of all, as the previous guest said, the austerity measures are really stringent. I mean, it's another 3.6% of GDP being taken out of the economy in an already depressed state, and that is going to continue to depress growth. And third, you can see that Eurozone authorities are already backtracking on their promise of debt relief. The head of the ESM just said that Greece didn't need debt relief at all. And so it's likely that any debt relief that Greece obtains will be too small to make a difference, and therefore it will continue to be weighed down by an unsustainable debt burden.
Yannis, I'd like to respond to some of what Philip has been saying, the fact that the Greek public administration system is not up to this task, the fact that there may not be debt relief for Greece, and that some of the austerity measures, as we also heard from the Greek ambassador earlier on, are pretty tough measures.
Yes, well, first of all, it is true that the Greek public administration is very, very problematic, let's say. Right now, the idea is, and the plan is, to have a new kind of task force, a new kind of assistance from the European institutions to come to Greece and assist the Greek authorities to implement these reforms. Of course, this is uncharted territory for Greece. We don't know if these reforms can be implemented, how the society and the public can adapt to these very, very difficult measures, and how also the public officials will respond. Because if we see cases of, let's say, white strikes and then being very opposite to the reforms, the public administration, it will be a very problematic situation. On the other issue of the debt relief, I think the European partners are very, very reluctant right now to provide a full-scale debt relief for Greece. That's for two reasons. One is a political reason, because in many, many countries of the Eurozone there is absolute no parliamentary majority for a debt haircut for the Greek debt. So we'll probably see some kind of a small debt relief in terms of making maturities longer and lowering just a little bit the interest rate. The question is, will that make a difference? Well, right now, any debt relief would not make a difference, because the biggest part, the chunk of the Greek debt matures beyond 2022. But the real issue is, if there is a significant debt relief, it will make the markets believe that Greece debt can be sustainable again, and then in 2 or 3 years, Greece could return to the financial markets and start financing its debt from its own resources again. This is the key question of how the markets will respond if the debt relief will not be adequate.
Philippe, is the Greek Prime Minister in a more difficult situation now than he was before the last round of negotiations? We saw those negotiations. There was a lot of brinkmanship. The Greeks blinked first. Is he in a worse position now?
Well, he now has to try and defend the decision he took back in July to not go with his then Finance Minister Yannis Varoufakis' plan to introduce a parallel currency, but rather to sign up to even more onerous bailout conditions than were being offered back in January or even at the end of June. And now he has to defend that. In a sense, he sounds a lot actually like the old Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Tsipras, in defending these kinds of decisions. I think at some point he'll probably decide that it's in his interests to break with Eurozone creditors in some sort of way, but for the moment he needs to stick with it. And the problem is that the bailout agreement isn't going to work. It repeats the mistakes of the previous ones. He isn't going to get the debt relief that he's promised Greeks in any way or form enough to let Greece out of the debtor's prison that it's in. And therefore, at some point, he's going to decide that he needs to break with the bailout, and then we get back into the same old mess we were in a few months ago.
Yannis, how are the Greek people responding to all of this? As we heard from the ambassador, I mean, some of these measures that are called for in the plan are pretty stringent. You get the retirement age going up, pensions being cut, countries' banks still in trouble, state assets are going to be sold.
Yes, absolutely, and we still don't know the details of the pension cuts. They will be submitted to the Parliament next month. It will be the next wave of reforms that will take place in November. So there is talk that there will be cuts between 8 and 15%, which is really on top of about 25% of cuts that took place in the previous years. And also Greece will face probably a recession of 5% in the fourth quarter of the year, which is a really, really big recession. So we really don't know how if the people have really realized what is ahead. The Prime Minister was very clear the other night at the Parliament, saying there is a tough road ahead, but I'm not quite sure that the Greek population has really realized how tough it will be for the next 2 years.
Philippe, I just want to pick up on a point you made earlier on, that Greece could return to the situation it was in just a few months ago. And that situation would be what? Further discussion on Greece's membership of the European Union, perhaps writing off the country's entire debt? What will that mean?
Well, I think it's politically unsustainable to have a permanently depressed economy with an unsustainable debt burden, in effect being run as a colony by its Eurozone creditors. And at some point, that situation is going to overflow, boil up, cause political turmoil again. And either it will come because the Prime Minister makes a decision that his remaining in office and his popularity requires him to break with the creditors in some way, or it comes from other political forces in the country saying enough is enough. The thing is that the Greek leverage is very weak as long as they are terrified of leaving the euro, and as long as they don't in effect trust their own government to run the affairs of Greece properly outside a monetary union, which has in effect become a debtor's prison.
So, Philippe, what are the key benchmarks we should be looking at in the weeks and months ahead?
Well, I mean, the most important thing now is that the Greek government needs to implement the list of reforms needed in order to receive the next tranche of the bailout. It needs to complete the first review, which opens the negotiations for debt relief, hopefully before the end of the year. And really pressingly, it needs to get on with recapitalizing the banking system before the new EU recapitalisation rules come in next year, under current rules, it would be able to recapitalise the banks without haircutting or bailing in depositors, which would basically be small businesses. It needs to do that before the end of the year, when it can do so only bailing out the bondholders, only bailing in the bondholders. Because if you bail in the depositors, you get rid of the working capital of small Greek businesses, and that will cause much greater economic damage.
Yannis, I want to look at another thing that's affecting Greece right now. You have a refugee crisis right now, refugees from the Middle East streaming into Greece. What is that doing to the country?
Well, this is a real crisis, especially for the islands of the Aegean. They're totally full of refugees arriving every day in thousands, not even hundreds. Well, the European Union took some very urgent measures a couple of weeks ago, and we need to see until the end of November how these measures will take place. It will come into effect. In 2 days, supposed to be the first wave of relocation of refugees from Italy to Sweden. And in the next few weeks, also refugees from Greece will be relocated in other countries of the European Union. The Prime Minister of Austria was in Lesbos, the island of Lesbos, which is really hardly hit from the refugee crisis, was there, and he was really struck by the capacity of the whole situation, of how severe it is. It is a true humanitarian crisis, but I think the Greek people and so far the Greek officials have been responding responsibly, let's say, but they're totally under, they're not sufficiently managed to handle the crisis.
Yannis, Koutsomitis, Philippe, Legrain, thanks to both of you for joining us.